Welcome back to iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon. You can contact us on social media at iPropertyRadio or email hello@iPropertyRadio.com. Next up this week, I'm chatting to Paul Mitchel of Mitchel McDermott Construction Consultants. Paul, welcome back to the show. It's good to see you again.
Thanks very much for having us back, Colin.
Paul, I don't normally depend on you to bring us some good news, but I think today I might be looking for some. The construction industry is really under siege at the moment. You know, it feels like we just came through recovery to be hit with Brexit and then the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine. The pressure on construction is coming from all sides. What kind of overview can you give us?
Yeah, it is. It is under pressure. I suppose it did deal with Brexit. It largely dealt with COVID. Responded really well, actually, to COVID. And I suppose coming out at the end of that last year, when we were all looking forward to a much more positive year ahead, obviously the unfortunate situation Ukraine hit, which probably, because of the uncertainty around it, raised more risk. And I think there's a greater awareness of risk amongst the contracting community. They're much more wary about getting into contract. But I suppose the industry has overcome all the challenges heretofore, and they are working their way around this challenge as well. And developing new supply chains, getting the materials and products from non-affected countries. Obviously, everywhere is affected in terms of productivity, still by COVID. And I think the latest wave, albeit not as medically serious, is just slowing productivity and affecting construction. The biggest probably issue out there is still inflation, cost inflation. There are some green shoots emerging over probably the last month or so in relation to kind of commodities like steel, reinforcement, timber, aluminium, but that's at the commodity level if you look at how it's traded. But it is an indicator then of when that material comes to our shores, brought on board and then resold to contractors and priced into projects. We're starting to see the beginning of reduced costs in those areas, which is very welcome.
Paul, just this morning, RTE reported that the high prices have forced the first contraction in the construction sector in over a year. I presume this wasn't unexpected.
No, I think one of the issues with the high rate of inflation from the beginning of the year, on top of a heavy 2021, is it's starting to affect viability. So there are certain projects that are sensitive: housing, apartments, student accommodation, hotels, and there are a lot of those projects that are kind of in that cycle of value engineering, trying to get their costs down to meet their budget. Some are able to, some are not. So you are seeing stalled projects, and probably clients and promoters been a little more reticent to get their projects going until they can kind of see a path forward. So I think that's impacting that piece.
It feels like we've been having the conversation around construction viability for the last number of years, certainly even, almost even before COVID. So part of that, we were looking at the delays, we were looking at Irish Water, we were looking at zoning, we were looking at planning, and all of these things are still issues, all of these things. And, you talk about risk, but I can remember once, years and years ago, the head of a main contractor once said to me, the business of construction, it's just all about risk. And it's like a game of hot potato. And it's like, how much can you pass over and not get left holding? And, as a mental image, that always really stayed with me in construction. So it seems to me that this is an industry that's quite good at understanding risk, assessing risk, and managing it. But certainly it feels like a perfect storm of all of these different risk factors, that so much of it is outside of an individual contractor's control. So what are you seeing in the marketplace now? Are there things in terms of viability? Just this weekend, with the first report of a contractor withdrawing from public work because the contract was no longer viable. But that was the first reported one. But actually, that's been happening quite a bit. So we know anecdotally it's been happening. And I know the Construction Industry Federation has really stepped up and warned about this last year and even earlier. And, steps have been taken towards it. So in terms of project viability, how vulnerable are the projects that are in place at the moment?
I think there's a few things in that. So going back, all of the issues that you mentioned there, touched on, are still all there. So planning delays, judicial reviews, public utilities, they are all still very live issues, and even more so for the same reasons: COVID disruption, supply chain disruption. But then I think the cost spikes. The fact a contractor can deal with inflation if they can somehow predict it and say it's 3% or 3.5%. But if they get spikes of double-digit inflation in a year, and if projects are delayed, and then if a contractor has to, are been asked to hold their price, and they agree to do it because they've been linked to that project, but then it spikes again, then it's very hard for the contractors to hold on. And you're right, contractors are good at assessing risk because they need to be. But at the same time, the main contracting level is one thing. It's all of the supply chain underneath. It's all the subcontractors. And the contractor may hold the risk of managing all of those subcontractors. But certainly we've seen projects where subcontractors haven't been able to deliver, have been changed out. We haven't seen that much by way of insolvency, which I think is very positive. And I know there's lots of talk about the impending doom, but I think by contractors taking that position to say, no, I am going to not go ahead with this contract, or I do need a price increase if I'm going to move ahead, is actually a mature approach. As much as we don't want to hear it, it is a mature approach to construction, because what we don't want is, 2009, where we lost half of our top 10 contractors. So it is an issue, but I suppose what we have to see then is that the prices have gone up, projects have stalled. So in terms of that supply-demand balance, it's going to be a situation whereby contractors are going to be coming back saying, okay, I'm now eager to price. And if some of those green shoots continue and that price commodities start to fall, it's a question then of how long it will take to get back into the realm of viability.
Paul, is it fair to say that within Mitchel McDermott, a lot of your work would be with the project owners?
Yes, all our work is, yeah. Yeah, we don't work with contractors. Yeah.
How are the project owners? Because we've talked a bit on the show about how the state is reacting to this, and we know that moves are underway, and that's something that's been driven by the industry. But in terms of project owners, what is their appetite to go back to the table and meet with contractors?
I suppose every project is different, and they're very much governed by the development appraisal. I think if there's a wish to get that project moving, it's linked to the sale of that building to something else, and there's room to cater for that negotiation. Those projects are moving ahead. If it means that it puts the project into negative territory, they simply can't. And some of them are in that zone, and it really then depends on the kind of the individual client and the deal particulars. I think the wise clients are being flexible. They're not trying to push the model that worked a year ago, because it just won't work. So our procurement advice has changed completely in the last kind of 9 months. And where once we would have advised in particular procurement routes, now we're advising something different. And to be honest, we're changing that advice on a weekly basis, dependent on the deal, where the contractor is at, where the supply chain is at, and really trying to drill down to assess what is the actual risk. So what is the actual supply chain risk that we're worried about? What items do we need to isolate and maybe move into a risk mechanism that's dealt with under new clauses in the contract. So we have been able to move projects into contract, but at a much slower rate, because we've been trying to hit a moving target, if you want, in terms of the pricing.
In terms of risk, in other jurisdictions, we know that risk might be spread a little more evenly across the supply chain. That doesn't tend to happen in Ireland. So the main contractor carries quite a lot of risk. And I know it's been said to me by a number of different contractors, both on and off air, that that maybe Ireland's supply chain lacks the maturity that other jurisdictions might have. So, for example, if we look at the UK supply chain, that actually there might be larger players that are able to carry a little more risk, and we don't really have that in Ireland. Is that a fair assessment?
An interesting point, actually. What you'll find sometimes, I agree, some of the subcontracting supply chains have been slow to grow because of what happened in the crash. And so they act in a particular way, sometimes which is risk adverse, sometimes actually not being mature when it comes to risk and taking it on. What you find with the larger subcontractors, and some of them are much larger than the main contractors, is they're completely risk adverse, don't take any risk on board because they don't have to, because they're a very big company in their own right. So if they don't get that project from that contractor, there's plenty of other opportunities. So in actual fact, I'd kind of see it the other way around, where the main contractors have that influence over the subcontractors. They go back to back with the main contractor and they take the risk for that. It's when the supply chain can't carry the risk that they've taken on board. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, is that the subcontractor can't bear the risk, the main contractor can't bear the risk. So we are seeing funny things happening there where contractors, and there is most likely going to be some alternative dispute resolution as we move through this, because we've kind of got two areas. We've got projects that have been through COVID lockdowns and still have to be finished. I call them COVID projects. We've got other projects that we're trying to get into contract, which is we're starting from a high base already. So those projects are very much treated differently as to how we move through.
How will contracts change? Whether it's on foot of the inflationary pressures we've seen, take your pick, lucky,
Yeah.
You know, any of those, how are they influencing contracts today and going forward?
Yeah. So I think obviously we've seen the change in the public works contract, which is the 70-30 split on inflation, which I think was a wise move by the public sector, because it was recognizing the problem, dealing with it head on, gained the trust of the contracting fraternity, without which nothing would happen. And then I think what's happening generally in custom contracts, if you want, or bespoke contracts in the private sector, is, contractors may or may not take on the risk of quantities, which is commonly referred to as blue or yellow forms of contract. They may struggle to give you a fixed price contract where you buy out inflation at the start of the project. Now, I have actually never even dealt with a fluctuating price contract. That were before my time. And they are an administration nightmare in terms of trying to track every material and labor, when it was bought, when it should have been bought. So certainly in the contracts that we've done, we've pain gain mechanisms that highlighted particular hot rates or areas that were subject to inflation. So that's been a major change in terms of moving through. And then design risk is another area that contractors are kind of split on, to be honest. Some would prefer to have the control of a design team because they can manage it. Others would prefer not to have the responsibility and leave it client side. So those main headings have been up for grabs, certainly over the first half of this year.
From the project owner's point of view, though, do they favour the design and build contracts?
It really depends. Like, design and build is very big in the UK. So you find with the UK clients, they want to go design and build. it's done slightly differently here. And the main contractors here still kind of go down a traditional route. They may take design and build risk, but they may not necessarily be the full designers of the scheme. So you have a lot of novated design and build schemes. So from that point of view, it's different. I think it depends on the client. If they have control over it, but then they can move the risk over to the contractor side, contract stage, that tends to be a preferred option.
Okay, and just you mentioned there that the government did step up and have this 70-30 split in terms of the inflation risk. Now that was backdated to the start of the year. Should this have been backdated into 2021?
You see, I suppose if you look at it when, we issued our info card at the beginning of the year, and we had said inflation for this year is a prediction 6 to 7%. And we've already experienced that in the first 6 months. So we're coming off the back of, double-digit tender inflation last year. So I suppose from that point of view, it was, okay, now everyone thought it would dissipate as supply chains came back into order. But then with the Ukraine war, but on top of it, actually now the problem is too big to manage. It's not going to dissipate. So I think the timing was probably right. I think it was right because had we not had Ukraine, and you can never say what if scenarios, but if we didn't have a Ukraine scenario, we probably would have started to see the supply chain starting to mend and some of that kind of hyperinflation starting to reduce over this year.
Very good. You mentioned there the info cards. As you know, I am a huge fan of Mitchel McDermott info cards. They are my shorthand to the industry. So thank you so much. And I know so many others would agree with that. So for anybody who's not familiar with them, go on to head to the Mitchel McDermott website and check out those info cards. They really are they really show an overview of the industry at a glance and then break them down further according to your interest. So it's definitely worth looking at. Before we finish up, Paul, before I let you go, and I am conscious of your time here, what are your expectations? You mentioned there that the expectations at the start of the year for 12 months have come to fruition really in the first 5.5 to 6 months. What are your expectations for the rest of the year?
Hoping that things start to improve. So the reductions we're seeing at commodity level make their way into material prices being priced by contractors. We're seeing that already with reinforcement, that continuing to march. The one bit that's probably harder to predict is the supply and demand. So you would hope that with, contractors pricing less projects, they would be more eager to price new work. And certainly when you look out to next year and you look at the top 10 contractors, there's about 50% capacity there at the moment. So those contractors are looking for new work next year. So you'd hope to see that. I don't think we'll see that until Q1 next year. The typical thing, you get to the end of summer, the clients are starting to see what they're doing. Will they re-tender their projects? So, and I think then the only kind of amber light I'll flash is that if everyone rushes to the gate at once, it will affect the supply and demand. So I think the positive thing about the industry is that we have a backlog of work to build yet, and that's going back to crash days in terms of, the housing numbers, and we know all about the residential situation. So there is a backlog of work to get built.
And I suppose in terms of that work being built, or those projects actually being delivered, will the industry be able to deliver them with the pressure?
I think so. What we have to see is that costs come down, viability gets reassessed. They now got a green light, then they go to market, and then in the going to market bit, it would be much better if that's staggered. The projects that are not as prone to viability, narrow margins go first, followed by others, and we have an orderly queue. Don't think we've ever seen an orderly queue. So that bit is the kind of unknown. But I think once the industry starts to unlock and unjam, I think then we'll see back to productivity levels again. But it's going to take a while for it to settle down, and that's obviously just judging it as of today, and excluding any other impending shocks that might be out there.
Okay, and hopefully there won't be any other impending shocks. Yes. It has been such a turbulent few years, but thank you so much for taking us through that. That was Paul Mitchel of Mitchel McDermott Construction Consultants. We need to take a quick break. Stay tuned.